All right, let's jump right in. In today's explainer, we're tackling an ancient historical mystery that is literally going to shift how you view the origins of evil. We're going to play historical detectives for a bit, digging into ancient texts, uncovering some wild linguistic clues, and tracing the shifting empires of the ancient world. It's a fascinating journey into how we as humans understand wrongdoing. So get ready to look at a very familiar concept in an entirely new light.
Okay, we're actually going to start with a surprisingly modern story. Back in the year 2000, the captain of the South African cricket team, Hansie Cronje, got caught up in this massive match-fixing scandal. And when he finally confessed, both to a church leader and an official commission, he used these exact words. "In a moment of stupidity and weakness, I allowed Satan and the world to dictate terms to me." Now, what's so fascinating about that quote is how perfectly it captures this deeply ingrained human reflex. When we do something wrong, whether it's rigging a major sports match or just messing up in our own personal lives, we naturally reach for some external force to blame. Satan made me do it. It's kind of the ultimate excuse to externalize our guilt. But honestly, where do we even get this concept of a personalized external force of evil? Well, to figure that out, we have to travel back thousands of years.
So, Section 1. Who incited King David, the crime, and the suspects?
To kick off our investigation, we need to look at a pretty controversial biblical crime. And the crime here is King David deciding to take a military census, basically a massive head count of his available troops. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth was counting soldiers a crime? Well, in the ancient context, a census was viewed as a huge sin of presumption and pride. David was basically relying on his own military might rather than trusting in divine protection. It was a major act of arrogance. But here is the central question of this explainer, and really the source of our whole historical whodunit: who actually pushed King David to do it?
This brings us to a glaring contradiction, which brilliantly sets up our core mystery. Take a look at these two historical accounts side by side. On the left, you've got the account from 2 Samuel, which says point blank, the Lord incited David to take the census. But then on the right, the exact same event is recorded in 1 Chronicles, and it reads, Satan stood up against Israel and incited David. I mean, wow, that is a massive textual contradiction. How can one account point the finger at God, while the other blames Satan? Did God do it, or did the devil do it? To solve this puzzle, we have to understand the vastly different worlds in which these two texts were actually written.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Persian Connection, uncovering the historical context.
To get to the bottom of this textual mystery, we need to zoom out for a second and trace hundreds of years of socio-religious history. The absolute key here is the timeline. The book of 2 Samuel was written way back in the pre-exilic period, roughly the 10th century BCE. And at that time, early Israelite theology viewed God as the sovereign source of literally everything, good and bad alike. But flash forward centuries later, the Jewish people were conquered and lived under the massive Persian Empire between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. It wasn't until after this period, the post-exilic era, around the mid-4th century BCE, that 1 Chronicles was written. And that middle period, living under Persian rule, it completely changed the game.
While living under Persian rule, the Jewish people were exposed to something totally new: Persian dualism and early forms of Zoroastrianism. See, the Persians worshipped a good god named Ahura Mazda, who was locked in this epic cosmic struggle against a distinctly separate, evil force. Now, looking at this impartially from a historical critical perspective, scholars note that exposure to this cosmic worldview of good versus evil slowly shifted the Jewish theological framework. The older, strict idea of God being responsible for absolutely everything started to evolve. Instead, negative things like tests or malicious actions started being attributed to an intermediary or an adversary. We actually see physical traces of this in historical artifacts. Take the famous Daiva inscription, carved by the Persian king Xerxes around 480 BCE. It was a royal decree outlawing the worship of Daivas. Now, historically speaking, Xerxes was originally just using that word to describe rebellious nations causing him political headaches, but over time, the concept of Daivas slowly morphed in the broader culture into a belief in actual spiritual demons. It's fascinating. We are literally watching the gradual personification of enemy forces right before our eyes.
Moving on to Section 3, the linguistic clue, the evolution of a word.
Let's pivot our investigation right back to the biblical text itself, because there is a massive linguistic clue hiding in the original Hebrew. And this is honestly mind-blowing. The original word used in 1 Chronicles is simply Satan with a lowercase s. In Hebrew, this word literally just meant an adversary, or an opponent. And here's the kicker. In the original text of 1 Chronicles 21:1, this word actually lacks the definite article. It doesn't say the Satan, and it's definitely not capitalized as a proper name. It translates simply to an adversary stood up against Israel. A lot of scholars point out this could have originally just referred to an earthly, human military foe that was threatening David, which is exactly why he got nervous and counted his troops in the first place. It wasn't until way, way later that this word became a proper noun for the devil.
So if we look at the big picture, we can map out the evolution of this figure in 3 distinct steps. Step 1, it starts out as a simple noun, an earthly human adversary like a rival army. Step 2, under the influence of the Persian era, it morphs into a heavenly intermediary. Think of an angel or a prosecutor in God's heavenly court, used by God to test humans, which, by the way, is exactly how this figure functions in the book of Job. And finally, step 3, by the New Testament era, influenced by centuries of shifting worldviews, this figure fully solidifies into the ultimate autonomous personification of evil, the ruler of darkness as we know the concept today.
All right, Section 4, Reconciling the Contradiction, Harmonizing the Two Texts. Let's bring things back to that initial glaring contradiction between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. How do conservative scholars resolve this mystery today? Well, they use the theological concept of primary versus secondary causes. Basically, they harmonize the texts by arguing that both accounts are actually true. How is that possible? By looking at motive and goal. God's motive is benevolent. God permitted the census test to discipline and humble David, kind of stripping away his military pride. But the adversary's motive is malicious. That figure incited David with the goal of causing harm, destroying Israel, and ruining David's prestige. So essentially, God sovereignly permitted a test, but an adversary maliciously carried it out.
And you know, this is not an isolated incident at all. There are several famous biblical precedents for this kind of dual involvement from both God and an adversary. Think about the trials of Job, where God permits the testing to purify Job's faith, while the adversary acts purely maliciously to destroy it. Or the betrayal by Judas. An evil force enters Judas to destroy Jesus, but God uses that very event to redeem humanity. Even with the testing of Peter, the adversary asks to sift him as wheat, but it's ultimately used to strengthen Peter's faith. It's a recurring theological theme where you have these overlapping yet totally opposite intentions.
And that brings us to Section 5, Diagnosing Evil, the Human Condition. Now, let's tie all of this ancient theological history back to modern human nature, because this is why it really matters for us today. We need to talk about a concept called social theological diagnostics. I know, it sounds a bit academic, but it's actually a fascinating term for the cultural and religious strategies we humans use to answer one fundamental question: where did it all go wrong? See, when we experience a crisis or when we just mess up morally, we desperately need an explanatory model. We need some way to diagnose the malaise of the human condition.
Scholar Louis C. Jonker hits the nail on the head here. He says, the emergence of the understanding of evil as a force outside Yahweh became the explanatory models used in social theological diagnostics. Basically, across centuries, through shifting empires, translation tweaks, and evolving theologies, humanity meticulously developed the figure of an external adversary. And just like we saw with our cricket player, Hansie Cronje, at the very beginning of this explainer, we are still using these ancient frameworks today to externalize our guilt and explain away our own bad decisions. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. We've spent literally thousands of years developing this external figure to point the finger at when things go south. But if we didn't have an adversary to blame, how would we diagnose the evil within our own human nature? It kind of forces us to look in the mirror instead of out the window, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into history leaves you with a lot to chew on.